faithfully conveying value and interpreting great books worldwide. Hi, this is Sally's Book Talk. Today, we'll interpret for you the book Kingdom of Ice with the subtitle The Polar Expedition of the USS Jeannette. It's an epic adventure. In the 19th century, the North Pole was still a mystery to humans. Legend has it that at the center of the North Pole, there's a warm sea and a fertile continent. If you find a passage through the sharp ice around it, you can reach that legendary paradise. Driven by this vision, expeditions flocked to the Arctic, hoping to pioneer the discovery of the Arctic continent. The USS Jeannette was one of them. However, the crew didn't know they were embarking on the most tragic Arctic expedition ever. They were first trapped on barren ice for nearly 2 years, isolated with no help, and nobody knew where they were. Then they traversed half the Arctic Ocean in bitter cold. Ultimately, one-third of the crew made it to Siberia and survived tenaciously. And all this happened without modern equipment. The author of Kingdom of Ice, Hampton Sides, is an American historian and journalist who has written for top magazines like National Geographic and The New Yorker. He's written many best-selling adventure nonfiction books, and Kingdom of Ice is one of them. This book was Amazon's best book of 2014, and it was highly recommended by major media like Time Magazine and The Washington Post. How did the Jeannette get into peril? What did the crew encounter on the ice? How did people survive over 2 years in the polar regions with no communication? Our story begins with Captain DeLong. In 1879, when the Jeannette departed from San Francisco Harbor, DeLong was 34 years old, a U.S. Navy lieutenant deeply obsessed with the Arctic. 6 years earlier, DeLong went to the Arctic as a deputy commander to search for a long-lost warship. Inside the Arctic Circle, he saw magnificent sights he'd never seen before. There were iceberg fjords, mirages, blood-red lunar halos, seals poking heads from the ice, and bowhead whales spouting water. These places were remote and intricate like a maze. DeLong became crazily obsessed with the Arctic from then on. He talked endlessly about the Arctic, burying himself in Arctic literature and maps all day. As his wife said, the Arctic virus stayed in his blood. To go back to the Arctic, DeLong spent years raising funds and recruiting, driven by curiosity, fame, and a desire to win glory for America. In Sally's Book Talk, we covered Antarctica, showing early polar explorers weren't pure. They represented countries to claim land, not for science. In the 19th century, top polar expeditions were led by the British Admiralty, but DeLong aimed to bring honor to America. But back then, the Arctic was a mystery. Ships near 80 degrees north were always blocked by ice floes. What was the North Pole like? No one knew how to reach the North Pole, whether there was an ice-free route, monsters on the ice, or lost civilizations. Some even claimed the Arctic led to a vortex to Earth's core. Is that true? These questions deeply troubled people. About the Arctic, a popular theory then was the open polar sea, meaning a belt of ice floes near 80 degrees north surrounded the Arctic with a warm sea beyond it. This was due to two warm currents. One is the Gulf Stream, the world's largest, covered in school geography. So the other is the Japan Kuroshio, the strongest warm current in the western North Pacific. It's called Kuroshio because it carries nutrients that make it look darker. In short, these currents flowed north. Explorers believed they'd breach the ice belt, find the gap, and you'd reach a warm green polar paradise. Some even thought isolated civilizations lived in that warm sea. The open polar sea theory was widely influential. Some publishers labeled Earth's top as open polar sea. Even the British Admiralty called it a vast sea. In an era of poor polar science, many backed the theory, led by German geographer Petermann. He's interesting, an Arctic expert who never went there. His farthest trip was to America, so he was called an armchair traveler. He was a homebound researcher, rarely traveling like other geographers, but he excelled at gathering explorers' latest findings and having his cartographers compile them into maps. Since his institute published the world's most exquisite maps, he became one of the most famous geographers globally. Peterman learned of DeLong's Arctic plans and offered strong support, enthusiastically providing his armchair academic advice. Innovative and daring tone, expedition ships all headed to the Arctic via Greenland, but Peterman suggested DeLong take the Bering Strait, an untried route. The Bering Strait lies between Asia's easternmost point and America's westernmost point, connecting south to the Pacific Ocean. To the north is what we now call the Arctic Ocean. Why choose the Bering Strait? Peterman gave two reasons. First, the Bering Strait is where the Japan-Kuroshio current breaks north through the ice to the Arctic. Second, based on maps and legends, not far north of the Bering Strait, there's a mysterious continent called Wrangel Land. Peterman firmly believed that around this land was the open polar sea, with high strategic value. Once DeLong landed, he could claim it for America. Today, we know theories like the open polar sea don't hold up, but back then, they were quite persuasive. Just using the Bering Strait as the entry to search for Wrangel Land and the open polar sea became DeLong's Arctic expedition goal. Everything was ready except for funding. Exploration is a costly venture. Where would the money come from? DeLong was lucky to meet a financier named Bennett, who was like a soulmate. Bennett was the publisher of the Herald, the third richest man in New York City. At that time, the Herald was one of the world's largest and most influential newspapers. Bennett knew how to make news eye-catching, boosting sales, and he was an outdoor and adventure enthusiast. He believed solving such geographical puzzles could spread knowledge and sell more newspapers. So when DeLong approached Bennett, the two hit it off immediately. Bennett generously funded DeLong's Arctic expedition and named the ship after his sister Jeanette. And that's how the Jeanette got its name. On July 8, 1879, the Jeanette set sail from San Francisco Harbor. The whole city flocked to the docks, forcing police to set up barricades for crowd control. This ship carried not only DeLong's ambition, but also America's expectations. Right after departure, DeLong became a national hero praised across U.S. newspapers. Some papers even claimed Columbus paled in comparison to the Jeanette. America was then in the famous Gilded Age, marked by mass immigration, booming economy, and rapid wealth growth. The Jeanette embodied the Gilded Age. Who hailed from Germany, Denmark, Ireland, Finland, Scotland, Norway, Russia, plus 3 Chinese. These Chinese were a cook, steward, and cabin attendant, all sharing the American dream to discover the Arctic and achieve glory. The first month went smoothly. They crossed the Bering Strait and bought 40 sled dogs en route. And on September 4th, nearly 2 months in, the crews sighted their destination, Wrangel Land. At first, they thought it a mirage, but confirmed it was solid land upon closer inspection. Joy came suddenly, everyone was ecstatic, but the plot twisted beyond imagination. As they neared Wrangel Land, the ship crashed into massive ice floes. Ice closed in from all sides, trapping the ship. Crew and dogs jumped on ice, pulling desperately, but ice slowly sealed the waterway. Imagine, even if the boat cracked an opening for the hull to squeeze through, the gap at the stern would seal shut again. The ship was forcing through ice. After 3 days' struggle, it froze solid, unable to move, utterly humiliating. DeLong planned to winter on Wrangel Land, yet reality was, it lay before them, unreachable. From that moment, the Jeanette would be icebound for 663 days, half an endless polar night. Around the ship, it's all ice. You might ask, since they could see Wrangel Land, why didn't they abandon ship for the island sooner? Because seeing it from sea could mean it's far off, and in the vast, empty Arctic Ocean, The ship was their only lifeline. You might not believe it, but go trapped on ice for 2 years. They not only survived, but lived quite well. This was because the Jeanette carried enough supplies for all 33 crew to survive healthily for 3 years. Their food was ample and varied. For example, they brought over 20 tons of pemmican, weighing as much as a dozen family cars. This pemmican is made from dried meat, berries, and fat, like compressed biscuits. Small but calorie dense. Plus, they had canned foods, cooked meats, alcohol, and barrels of concentrated lemon juice to prevent scurvy. Sometimes they hunted animals like polar bears, seals, and walruses on the ice. The Chinese chef used local ingredients to make dishes like seal meat stuffing, fried dough, and walrus sausage. Besides food, they lived pretty comfortably too. The Jeanette's coal bunker was modified to hold over 132 tons of coal. Oh, and Bennett spent hundreds of thousands to charter a ship for extra coal reserves. Though the supply ship had left when trapped, the coal left was enough for 3 years. Before departure, the crew modified the Jeanette for Arctic cold. Specific mods included thick felt insulation in cabins and foredeck, plus ordering fur coats, boots, and blankets from Alaska. So while freezing outside, inside cabins they could eat, work, sing, and play cards comfortably. DeLong knew that during long polar nights, people easily develop mental illnesses like depression. To protect mental health, he built a stocked library and a top-notch infirmary with selected games, a small organ. Every night they played instruments and sang, making DeLong say, "I feel like starting a choir." Though isolated on ice, the crew's life was quite eventful. They ice skated, played soccer on ice floes, and attended navigation classes at night. The Chinese cooks, Sam and Charlie, kept unique Chinese hobbies. After kitchen work, they'd fly colorful kites on the ice. DeLong prepared countless things for the Jeanette, like Edison's new electric lights for polar nights to endure the darkness. Sadly, water damage prevented the lights from working. They also ordered Bell Lab's new telephone. So DeLong wanted it for ice expeditions, but damp copper wires killed signals, ending their trendy ice call plan. Meanwhile, news of the Jeanette's disappearance reached America. Newspapers nationwide urged, "People must know where DeLong and crew are." U.S. warships searched multiple times, but the Jeanette had drifted too far into the Arctic. All rescues failed. So the Jeanettes spent 2 New Years on ice. The crew's resilience was astounding. In deepest cold, they held cheerful Christmas feasts, appetizers to desserts, beer included. A main dish called Arctic turkey was roasted seal. They tap danced, played violins, guessed riddles, did stand-up. Cooks Sam and Charlie sang Cantonese folk songs. After these fun stories, don't think ship life was all carnival. Most days meant enduring endless nights, loneliness, monotony, and near-fatal dangers. Once, strange symptoms emerged. Fatigue, no appetite, weight loss, anemia, even bloody urine. The doctors suspected lead poisoning. Without finding the source, all would go mad or die. The expedition's survival hung by a thread. Until a crewman chewed a metal ball in tomato soup, inspiring the doctor. Tests showed the metal ball was lead. Their voyage was so long that acid in tomatoes reacted with the lead solder in cans, contaminating all their tomato supplies. These tomato cans were their precious scurvy prevention source. DeLong grumbled, "We avoided scurvy for 2 years, only to nearly die from lead poisoning in year 3. Such a loss. Day after day, the Jeanette became a slowly drifting ark on the icy sea. It drifted with the ice, crossing vast Arctic stretches, yet never escaped. Thus, the Jeanette circled Wrangel Land on the ice floes. Through observation, DeLong found Wrangel Land wasn't a pole-spanning continent as Peterman claimed, just an island. No open polar sea existed nearby. The Arctic was covered by shifting ice, and Japan's Kuroshio Gap was a myth. In truth, the Kuroshio weakened after Japan. Unable to carry heat to the pole, they never could have sailed there. In June 1881, Arctic summer arrived. Constant sun loosened ice around the ship. At midnight, June 11th, as most slept, ice cracked open. The Jeannette slid into water. After 663 days, the Jeannette finally floated on water. But joy was brief. Next afternoon, a terrible grinding sound echoed as the hull split open. Ice pressure had riddled the Jeannette with holes. It leaked and quickly sank. The long-ordered abandonment, the crew swiftly salvaged vital supplies onto ice. That night, 33 men and dogs camped on ice, watching the Jeannette sink slowly. It went down at 77 degrees north, just 1,100 kilometers from the pole, like Beijing to Shanghai. Reaching the pole was impossible. Isolated, they trekked 1,600 plus kilometers to Siberia, but survival odds were slim in that desolate permafrost, Russia's historic exile land. Beyond a few settlements, Siberia is mostly vast wilderness. DeLong had no choice, go to Siberia or die on ice, so he led the crew on an icy odyssey. If before, during 600 plus icebound days, the ship's cabin protected them, now they faced Arctic extremes directly. Summer ice was a maze, with rising temps, melting floes cracked everywhere. Crew waited 12 hours daily in icy water, hauling 8+ tons of supplies. They couldn't drag all that weight at once, had to make 2 or 3 trips, meaning every kilometer gained cost 5 kilometers walked. They lived like beasts, dragging gear with dogs, racing against time. Supplies lasted only 60 days. They had to reach Siberia before winter or freeze. Starvation awaited. The wet exhaustion was unbearable. Each step sprayed water and bloody plasma from their boots. While sleeping, body heat melted snow under blankets, trapping them in cold water pits. No one could endure this daily ice water slog alone. Some collapsed from exhaustion or illness, hauled on sleds by others. This burdened the team further. All suffered snow blindness, trench foot, gut diseases. The doctor stopped recording injuries. His painkillers ran out. Soon, some went mad, throwing things, cursing, even dogs snapped. Some dogs had violent seizures, others attacked packmates savagely. Unknown if dog madness came from illness or extreme fatigue, but they lost most dogs regardless. Worse, after 8 days marching south, DeLong's measurements showed they drifted north. They walked on ice, while ice floes drifted northward faster than they marched south. DeLong hid this, fearing total despair, confiding only in his right-hand man, Melville. Melville is the second most important character in the entire book. When he boarded the Jeannette, he was 38, a mechanical engineering genius who had worked at a U.S. Navy shipyard and was DeLong's most vital assistant. But Melville believed everyone had actually guessed what happened, as their faces showed disappointment and suspicion. So Melville bluntly announced the truth. The situation before us is utterly hopeless. While fleeing, DeLong and his team exposed another of Peterman's false theories. Peterman thought Arctic ice was fresh water, but tests showed saltwater. They drank salt water for a month, worsening their health. If they didn't find fresh water soon, they'd die from salt overdose before freezing or starvation. On July 12th, 1 month after the Jeannette sank, the crew's fate took a turn. That morning, the crew saw something shimmering on the horizon, an island. En route, seabirds and seals multiplied, and someone spotted a butterfly. This meant the island had rich animal resources. After map study, DeLong confirmed they'd found a new island. Land meant food and fresh water. He changed course straight toward it. Another good news now boosted their spirits. Melville's measurements showed their southward speed had outpaced the ice's northward drift. Their efforts paid off. Indeed, after marching 16 more days toward Siberia, DeLong's group reached the island, land with rushing streams, glaciers, and thousands of birds flying. Plus, the island had bears, foxes, rabbits, grouse, Someone wept with emotion. By now, 753 days had passed since they sailed from San Francisco. Delongific in naming tone after his financier. Bennett Island was like God's hand reaching down, pulling them back from death's edge. On the island, they drank sweet glacier meltwater, heated water over campfires, and took their first hot bath in months. They gathered wild plants and hunted seabirds. Those who'd had mental breakdowns became normal and happy here. But they only stayed on Bennett Island for 8 days because the Arctic summer was ending and time for escape was running out. Among the supplies they brought from the ship were 3 sled boats. Now they came into play. In the journey ahead, sometimes they could glide on water, but other times they had to chip through ice floes to advance. Conditions were so harsh that even the dogs couldn't take it anymore. One day, as the 3 boats slowed near an ice floe, 4 dogs jumped onto the ice and ran off, hopping and skipping. But since escape time was too precious, the crew couldn't chase the dogs onto the ice. That night, they heard those dogs howling on the ice floes. Days later, more dogs escaped onto the ice. Eventually, they had to kill all the dogs, because DeLong didn't want them to run off again. That'd only leave them suffering on the ice till starvation. On August 20th, 14 days after leaving Bennett Island, DeLong spotted New Siberia Island through his telescope, a Russian island in the Arctic Ocean. This meant they'd finally reached the known world. As they got closer to Siberia, sea ice melted and the boats entered open waters. But sailing at sea wasn't any more comfy than trekking on ice. Storms could hit any moment. Oh, and icy water drenched everyone. Plus, they could fall into the sea and drown any time. In September 1881, over 90 days after abandoning ship, they finally reached near the Lena River Delta in Siberia. At this point, they were only 100 kilometers from land. The Lena River starts from mountains near Lake Baikal and is the world's 11th longest river, flowing north into the Arctic Ocean. Due to ice blockage up north, the river water hits resistance at the estuary, spreading into countless channels, forming a super complex delta. According to the crew's plan, after reaching the Lena River Delta, they just needed to sail south along the river to eventually hit a local settlement. Then their 1,000-mile ice escape could be declared a victorious end. But these last 100-plus kilometers were the biggest trial of the whole escape. Trekking on ice was tough, but at least they had footing. Now, they faced the vast sea. These 3 small boats were already battered and could easily be swept away or smashed by waves. Even if they could cross the sea, they'd inevitably get separated in storms. So DeLong ordered that, if separated, they'd regroup at Boulogne on the coast. At the final moment, all still alive, the 3 boats bid each other luck and charged toward the river mouth in a last stand. True enough, after 34 hours sailing, the boats scattered in the storm. Only 2 reached near the Lena Delta. The 3rd vanished forever in icy waters. Melville's boat had better luck, landing near a settlement, quickly rescued by local Evenki people. But DeLong's boat was unlucky. Their landing spot was remote, far from people. Out of supplies, DeLong sent 2 fittest men south to seek help. When local natives rescued these 2, they unexpectedly met Melville. Learning DeLong's location, Melville took guides back to search. Sadly, they didn't find the crew, but found DeLong, who buried the logbooks, thus recovering the Jeanette's full expedition record. Survivors were later rescued by Russian officials. By then, the Jeanette's disappearance was a global sensation. Their rescue became big news in Russia. Melville thus gained the governor's support to lead a team back for DeLong. But the harsh conditions delayed them. When Melville finally found the missing group, it was the next year. By then, DeLong and 11 others lay buried deep in snow. After the 2 left, the rest weakened, gnawing their reindeer coats and boots, and they died one by one. DeLong recorded each death date in his diary. On day 21, his diary ended. Beside him lay a flag, sewn by his wife, meant for the pole. Per Melville's investigation, bodies preserved, no cannibalism. They upheld human dignity till the end. The Jeannette expedition lasted over 2 years, 1879 to 1881. Of 33 men and 40 dogs, only 13 men survived. DeLong and his companions' remains were later arranged jointly by the U.S. Navy and Russian government with a grand funeral ceremony, transported back to America and buried in a cemetery. In Russia, the island discovered by the expedition was collectively named the DeLong Islands. After returning home, Melville became a hero. He later rose to become the chief engineer of the U.S. Navy. Under his supervision, the U.S. Navy fleet underwent a large-scale reorganization, completing an epoch-making reform. He also wrote a best-selling book about the Jeannette expedition, fiercely defending DeLong's honor. Today, the Melville Award is the highest honor in the U.S. Navy for achievements in aeronautical engineering. After the Jeannette voyage, no one ever mentioned the open polar sea theory again. However, recent climate predictions show that, due global warming, by 2050, the Arctic ice will completely melt in summer, becoming another kind of open polar sea. Good kingdom of ice. That's all for today's interpretation. The reading notes are below the audio. See you tomorrow.